When you think of how a space mission is run, you normally think of a bunch of rocket scientists with pocket protectors, but it's no longer the same.
3, 2, 1, 0. We have a liftoff.
They knew that it was a groundbreaking spacecraft, but I don't think any of them imagined that 36 years later we'd still be talking to it.
Whenever we have a spacecraft that completes its mission, we always leave some ability that we can wake it back up.
They said that we couldn't raise the money for it. That was done in 30 days.
How far we've come, it's a testament to what crowdfunding can do.
They took this idea to just dig this thing from the depths of space and let's see if we can send a command to it.
We literally are the first in history outside of a government to command a spacecraft in interplanetary space.
We're dealing with something that none of us have actually seen with our own eyes. We just believe that it's out there.
Hello and welcome to this special hangout presented by Google Creative Labs and a whole load of other people on the momentous occasion of ISEE-3's fly past the moon, which is taking place in just under an hour's time. We have people from all over the world, but in particular we'll be coming live from McMoon's, the mission control based in an abandoned McDonald's down on the NASA Ames campus. I'm Chris Lintott. I'm inside and currently on exhibit at the Adler Planetarium. I'm an astronomer at the University of Oxford and present the BBC's Sky at Night. It's my job to be your host for the next hour and a half or so and try and keep some semblance of control over some very excited people. So as well as the team at McMoon's, who you can see who'll be dropping in over the course of the hangout while they attempt to control the spacecraft, we're joined by three experts online. We have Balint, surname's gone, Balint Sieber, currently in a hotel room in Las Vegas. He was responsible for the communications with the spacecraft, a critical piece of what's been this fabulous effort to get the spacecraft back online and ready for the passage near the Earth and past the moon today. So we're delighted to have him before midday in Las Vegas as well, which I think is particularly impressive. We have from Reading in the UK, Chris Scott. Chris was the project scientist for the heliospheric imager on the Stereo spacecraft. He's an expert in space weather, in the influence of the sun on the rest of the solar system. And is particularly excited, he told me, by finding out what ISEE-3 can tell us about the environment through which the Earth is passing over the next 2 weeks. So he's somebody who will be looking forward to using the data. And joining me, my soon-to-be colleague here at the Adler Planetarium, Lucian Valkovich, currently, I think, in New York. But an expert on, a member of the Kepler team, an expert on star spots, but of course a well-known popularizer of science and TED Fellow. It's great to have you all here.
Cheers, Chris. Looking forward to it.
Yes, good, excellent. We of course want to hear from you as well, dear viewer. You can send us questions throughout the Hangout using Google+, and of course Twitter. The hashtag to use is #ISEE3, and they will be fed through to me, and I can present your questions to the team as we go on. So just to recap, ISEE-3, as many of you will know, was launched, as we just heard, back in the early 1980s. It fulfilled its mission, then headed off on an extended mission to a comet, succeeded in being the first probe to reach a comet, and then was placed onto a long orbit heading back to Earth. And that's where we can pick up the story. Joining us from McMoon's, Dennis Wingo, the project director, and Keith Cowing, the in charge of publicity and also project director. Keith, Dennis, hello.
Greetings. Hello.
Hey, nice to hear from you both. To start with, what's the atmosphere like in the room next to you? How's Mission Control feeling this morning?
Noisy. It's a McDonald's. There's tile walls and everything's, kind of noisy.
Yeah, more fun than a barrel of monkeys.
Okay, good. And what exactly are the monkeys up to today? Then? What's the plan for the next hour or so?
We got a lot of folks talking about what we're doing. We have Dr. Farquhar here. We have a lot of other folks, and we're discussing the data that we've already seen and looking forward to the data that we're going to get.
Excellent. Well, we can cut to, we'll come back to you in a second, but we could go now to a video which gives the viewers some sense of where you are and what's going on at McMoon's. Excellent. So you got a sense there of where exactly Dennis and Keith are. I've got to ask you, why are you in an abandoned McDonald's?
Well, you know what? A number of years ago on another project, the Lunar Orbiter project we did, we really didn't need much more than a building that had locked doors. And we were offered two buildings that weren't being used, the barbershop and this old McDonald's. Well, somebody hit the barbershop with a truck so the door wouldn't lock. So we said, yeah, we'll take the McDonald's, the doors lock, and it's got nice ventilation systems. And it was free.
All right, fair enough. So a good real estate deal, essentially.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the ISEE project, and in particular today. Are you in control of the spacecraft, or are you sitting there receiving what it's doing? In other words, is the plot set, or are you still very much making adjustments?
No, the plot is set on the spacecraft right now. We did some final commanding Friday evening, but all the science instruments that we could commission are commissioned, and we're just waiting to receive data. It's all good.
Okay, and the spacecraft's healthy? You're picking up data?
Well, the data, we're getting plenty of data. All the science instruments are working. Everything on the spacecraft is working except for the propulsion system.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that in a second. How big a deal is the Lunar Flyby? It's clearly a important moment for the mission, but well, it's going to miss the moon by quite some distance.
Yeah, it would have gone closer, but this was sort of set in motion decades ago when Bob Farquhar and Dave Dunham fired the engine. We had hoped to make it come a little closer to the moon, swing around and do something else, but we weren't able to use the propulsion system the way we wanted to. So the nice thing about this, though, is that it's going by the moon. It'll go back into its orbit around the sun. And instead of having a mission close to Earth, we'll have the first citizen science interplanetary mission. We'll still be getting science.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the backstory. How did you two get involved? You've obviously got a track record of rescuing old data, but rescuing an old spacecraft is something slightly different.
Slightly.
Well, I've done a lot of work in spacecraft before. I've built my own spacecraft, and in February we saw where the Germans at Bochum Radio Observatory and the folks at AMSAT-DL had received a signal. So I'm going, oh, that's cool. And then NASA said, oh, it's going to be impossible to actually contact it. We're just going to watch it go by. And I'm going, why is it impossible? And then I called Keith, and the rest is history.
Because we've done this project here with Lunar Orbiter where they said the hardware's lost, all the information's, the tapes can't be read, everybody's dead, go away, and we don't have any money. So when this project came up, after having done that one, we said, well, okay, there's no hardware, everybody's dead, there's no software. What's so hard about that?
Well, the money is always a problem with these things, but you solved that problem by appealing to the crowd.
Yes.
Were you confident that you'd get the support you needed?
Not only confident, we'd done something similar for Lunar Orbiter, but we were pleased to quickly learn that most of our donations were $10 and $50, and that the vast majority of our donors weren't even space people. This was just people out there. I tweeted a joke about disco once, and I suddenly got donations from people saying, hey, I heard your comment about disco. I'm, okay.
What did you say about disco?
I was making, well, vinyl is back, and so is our spacecraft, and from the disco era, and I put a disco ball in the spacecraft, and that set them off, and the money came in.
Excellent. So all spacecraft need to have pop culture links embedded.
Exactly.
This is critical. Why do you think the idea of we're all here because the idea of getting in touch with an old spacecraft is fascinating. It really captured people's imagination. What do you think it was about that idea that makes you go, this is cool, and makes the public get interested as well?
Well, we're the first private entity in history to talk to a spacecraft in interplanetary space. And it's kind of the, David versus Goliath thing. And there's just many reasons that people like this. And we're, in some ways, we're surprised as anybody that it was so popular.
Well, your next question would be, well, why did you do it? Well, because we could. And nobody stopped us.
It's always a good question. Lucienne, you do a lot of excellent public outreach. Do you think that is why people are interested? Do you think people are excited by the fact that this isn't NASA? Or do you think there's something else going on?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, the thing for most people, I think, is to have a really strong personal connection to the things that we're doing out in space. I mean, spacecraft are our avatars in space. They're, the piece of us that we can really send out into space. And so to have a spacecraft that's being controlled really by, what one might call the public, but really by the American people directly, as opposed to through sort of a big agency like NASA, I think is really exciting. I think it gives people a sense of personal ownership over the mission and the data that will come back that will be, theirs to pour over.
Yeah, and Chris, speaking of the data, you said at the beginning that you're excited by what you might get. Can you give us a very brief sense of what we might get from the ISEE-3 spacecraft?
Well, there's two reasons I'm really excited about it. For a start, we're in a really unusual time for the sun, the solar wind. The sun's quieter than it has been in the last 100 years. And so every measurement we have is worth having. And the second is that we're really trying to get to grips with this business of space weather, the changes, the storms that can occur between the sun and the Earth. And what's important really to understand there is what the spatial scales of these things are. And we don't really have very many spacecraft or measurements doing this, compared with, say, meteorology, where we've got thousands of measurements. So even if it sounds like one extra measurement, when you've only got 6 others, that makes an incredibly great advance on the science that you can do. And understanding the spatial scales of these things is really interesting.
It's also heading off in an unusual direction, or at least it's not somewhere that the rest of the mission, the other missions are. Dennis and Keith, where exactly is the spacecraft now, and where is it heading once it swings past the moon?
Yeah, well, last night about 3 a.m., or actually this morning at about 3 a.m., it passed the closest to the Earth at about 190,000 kilometers. At 11:16 our time, Pacific time, it will pass within 12,000 kilometers of the moon. So yesterday it passed through what's called the magnetopause and the bow shock of the Earth's magnetic field, and we got that data, and the University of Iowa has plotted it, and to me it's just absolutely thrilling that we're getting all this space weather, just like what Chris was saying.
Great. Well, we'll come back to you as we go through the morning. Remember, you can talk to us via the hashtag ISEE-3 on Twitter or on Google+. But now let's have a look at another video. This one introduces the Reboot project, the effort that it took to get the spacecraft to where it is today. Some very happy people there at Arecibo. I think that those were shots from the first attempt to contact the spacecraft. Balin, if you can hear me, you starred in that video with some excellent dance moves. How did it feel to be talking to the spacecraft again?
It was unreal. Just had a little GoPro sitting there, just on the off chance things actually worked out, and we were very lucky they did. We had, attempted to send these commands out. We had recreated the modem. My former colleague and friend John Malsbury and I initially worked on the first version there, and we had anticipated all these potential issues. The documentation was quite ambiguous on certain specs, and so we built all that sort of redundancy in there, so it would go through and try all sorts of different combinations. And as it turned out, the best guesses that we had initially were the correct ones, and suddenly there was this moment where we were looking at the waterfall there, the spectrum analyzer, and then suddenly this single lonely little line burst full of modulation, and it was confirmation that we turned telemetry back on. And so everything leading up to that point, everybody's contribution, the dumpster diving, the decoding of the docs, everything sort of coming together to that one moment.
Yeah, and it was dumpster diving for science. It wasn't that you were able to walk into a NASA office somewhere, pull a binder down, and it said, this is how you contact the spacecraft. There's a lot of reconstruction to happen, right?
Yes, that's right. And I think my other colleagues can definitely expand on that. I was sort of fortunate enough to have the more sort of synthesized, filtered stuff come down at the end. But there are a huge number of documents that they poured through, and actually took the time to understand and decode. It was pretty amazing effort.
And you were at Arecibo, of course, working with the team at that very famous spacecraft. How did they react? Because, you know, this is a scientific instrument. People like me want to use it to point at galaxies and other things like that. And then you guys come along and say, we want to talk to a spacecraft, and we're not quite sure whether this is going to work. How were you received by the astronomers?
Quite positively. I think you know, it's fair to say that we all had a wonderful time down there. Of course, people are probably familiar, just as I was, from you know, the various Hollywood films. Contact is one of my favorites, and just having the opportunity to go there, it was an absolute blast. And the people that actually work there, they live and breathe the telescope and everything that goes on. And having this this project come along, which is a little bit outside the usual sort of science that goes on there, it created a lot of interest, and we were really happy that they were enthusiastic to help and do what was necessary to install the additional hardware we needed and get the systems running and be a part of it. So it was really great.
Great. Well, sorry, please.
I was just going to ask, because Arecibo is in a big crater. It's not hugely steerable. So what was your window for communicating with the spacecraft?
Well, it's interesting. Their telescope schedule is actually pretty fully booked. And during the day, they have maintenance windows that are sort of set aside for any electrical maintenance that needs to go on, for example. And they were nice enough to sort of allocate windows within that when the spacecraft would be visible from the telescope. So it would creep earlier every day by 2 minutes, but initially, I think when we got there, we would start at about 2:30-ish, and we would be on for around about 2 hours and 45 minutes. So it would consist of you know, tracking the telescope, finding the signal, peaking it up. Initially, the ephemeris data that we had was stale, so it was a matter of sort of doing a search and finding the strongest signal, and they were successful in doing that, which is great. And because it's the biggest dish, we had a really powerful signal, even though at that stage it was 15.3 million kilometers away, which was unreal. And the two-way light time was, in fact, I think 105 seconds. So we would send this command out, start the clock, and just wait and pray.
I love the language of this. The ephemeris is stale is a way of saying you didn't know where your spacecraft was.
We did. I mean, the very first time that the dish was pointed in the direction in which the numbers predicted it would be, we did find a very weak signal. I mean, we hooked it up and I recorded some data and did some initial analysis, and you could just see this tiny little peak there. And when you bring it up on a waterfall plot, you know, with the diagonal due to the Doppler shift as the Earth rotates, it would just be visible, and it was confirmation that we could see it too, and it was alive, and it was a great starting point.
Excellent. Well, we'll come back to you in a second. Standing by at McMoon's, I hope we can talk to Marco. I hope this gets right. Kalaluri, I think. Marco, are you there?
Yes.
How close did I get?
Oh, that's great.
All right, good.
Thanks.
So you're the attitude and orbit control system engineer, which for the rest of us meant that your job was to work out how to use the thrusters on the spacecraft. At the point that we were just talking about, the plan was to try and get ISEE-3 into orbit around the Earth. How plausible did that look at the beginning?
Well, at the beginning, at the very beginning of this project, it seemed quite difficult, but we made such rapid progress with everything that by the time we got to the point that I think you guys are talking about, and by the time we got to doing the spin-up maneuver, it looked really good. You know, we were able to fire the thrusters to increase the spin rate, and it performed very much how we thought it would. And you know, we were just super excited because, I mean, we just moved a spacecraft in interplanetary space. It was pretty awesome.
So can you say something about how big are the thrusters? Like, what sort of propulsion system are we talking about?
Sure. So there are no main engines on this spacecraft as you think about when you visualize, you know, satellites going through space in pop culture. All it has are 12 rather small thrusters. You know, probably on the order about that big at the end, and those were what was used throughout the entire mission to change the trajectory. So anytime that they did, you know, when they did their comet flyby and all of that, they used it. They fired these little tiny thrusters a lot of times, and they got the thrust they needed.
So you managed to get control of the spacecraft. The thrusters fired. What happened then?
Well, this is where, you know, part of part of the project started to get a little bit more difficult. So we managed to get the thrusters to fire, but one of the things that we didn't know at the time, we were looking at a lot of the telemetry coming back, and we weren't sure which parameters were reading correctly, if any of the systems had failed, and part of what we had to do was figure out what was working and what wasn't working by testing it out. So when we went to do the trajectory correction, we went to fire the thrusters, and they started to fire, and everything started to look good, and we started thinking, yeah, this is awesome, and then all of a sudden we saw the thrust just trail off, and then it became this big thing to figure out, what's going on. And that's really that's where my position went from there.
Do we know what happened?
We think at this point we have a pretty good idea about what happened, but why it happened we still are not sure. So we've been able to go through and run a lot of tests on the spacecraft. We came in, a lot of days to figure out what we could do, and we figured out basically that, we think the thrusters, they are working. Little valves are opening and closing. The valves throughout the rest of the thing are opening and closing. They're showing good signals. We have fuel, but what we don't have is pressurant. So it's kind of like a spray paint can that has paint, but no gas. So you shake it and squeeze it, and nothing comes out.
And that's why we're at this Lunar Flyby situation. We had a question, actually. See, I don't know whether navigation is your department as well. We had a question from TBM Rose, Travis Benrose on Twitter. Where will the Moon Flyby send the probe? So we swing by the Moon today. What happens next?
So, and actually, this is one of the things where I think Google's website does a really good job of visualization for this. They've shown, I'm not actually the trajectory guy, but we do have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen to the spacecraft. And it's going to continue around Earth for a little while, and then it's going to go back out into an orbit very similar to Earth's orbit. And, they have a pretty good graphic up there. I think eventually the two spacecraft, as they go around, are going to catch up to each other again. Well, two spacecraft, one Earth and one spacecraft. As they go around, they're going to catch up to each other again in about 15, 17 years, something like that. So it's not gone. It's still around. It's just, not exactly around Earth.
Well, do join Chris.
It's like the Earth throwing a stick for a dog, and then the Earth's going to go and pick it up again.
Yes.
Do join us for a hangout in 16 or 17 years' time, when we'll discuss the second pass. Joining us as well, sorry, I should have introduced you earlier, is Casey Harper, another member of the project team. Actually, I was going to start. We got a question from Linda Leben, or Lieben, I guess, who wants to know what kind of backgrounds the scientists working on the project have. And in particular, Casey, maybe you could tell us how you came to be involved in this project.
Well, I kind of got into this a little informally. I'm an intern, and I've worked on previous projects in McMoon, so it's not my first time being part of something that Dennis has worked on, nor that Keith has also worked on. So I was interning, and they needed help, and so I volunteered to sort of work on it because the project seemed interesting, and they could have used a couple of extra hands to do some of the non-as-technical work, so the engineers can do all the stuff that they really need to get done, and I can do some of the finding of stuff and all that. So I just became a part of the project, and at some point Cameron comes over to me and is like, do you want a job? And I'm like, sure, I'd love to do a job. And so he hands me this iPad and is like, we need you to do the timing for the controls and for the commands, sorry. And it was just really exciting. I sat next to Jacob, in between Jacob and Ballin, and did the timing, and I fumbled a few times, but pretty much my background is just I was an intern, and I happened to just fall into the project.
Be in the right place at the right time. So what's been the most exciting part of the project for you?
I think the aspect that these aren't people who are necessarily from NASA. These are people who, they're like, well, we wanted to do it, so we did, kind of people. And I've always admired the kind of determination and perseverance from an unofficial source that wanted to get involved in space and pretty much wanted to see if they could do this, and so they went out and did it. And so the exciting part of it was just seeing all that happened and how much hard work and dedication definitely goes into doing something like this, especially as an outside standpoint.
What about the day that you got to push the button, though?
Oh, I got to push the button. That was exciting. I did. So that was definitely, I was definitely excited about that. we made sure everyone was sending a command out, and he turns to me and he's like, "Do you want to push the button?" I'm like, "Yes, I want to push the button." And so I hit enter, and it was awesome. And I told everyone I knew after that. And
what command was that? What you pressed? Do you know what it was that you were?
It was one of the final commands for one of the days. Actually, it was I put it into science mode. I believe that was the command for one of the days that we did before they had switched it back to engineering and had done more commands. I had put it into science mode. So.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Good. Nothing like switching into science mode.
Yeah.
Lucienne, you've worked with Kepler data. There is something special about getting data and talking to a spacecraft.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I remember right at the very beginning of the mission after launch, a group of us were gathered down at Ames, not very far from McMoon's at all, and watched the ejection of, what you could think of as Kepler's lid. So there was a dust cover that was over the telescope aperture, and it was very important that we ejected off of the telescope. Otherwise, of course, Kepler's eye would have been closed, and we wouldn't have gotten all of this great data. And so we all got together and watched the feedback from the telescope and waited for that kick as the cover blew off. And we even saw in some of the detectors a glint from the sun's kind of sparkling off of the telescope lid. And of course, you don't get a picture of this. You just get a lot of numbers on a screen, really. But if you know what they actually mean and what's happening, it's really, really exciting, especially that it's happening real time, and that, it's the beginning of a really exciting time of gathering data and making discoveries.
Well, speaking of real time, we're about 10 minutes now from the Lunar Flyby, which will indeed be marked by numbers on a screen. ISEE-3 doesn't have a camera board. We can, though, go quickly to a video that introduces some of the other team that have been involved in making this mission happen. You saw there at the end Bob Farquhar and David Dunham, who are from the original ISEE-3 team. They'll be joining us shortly. It's also good to see that people have telescopes inside their office, as indeed all professional astronomers do. Ballard, sorry. What the spacecraft is sending data back now. How's that being received on the ground? You're not using Arecibo today.
No, not today. We've been really lucky. Dennis in particular was able to reach out to these different groups, different dishes. The two that we're currently using and have the systems hooked up are Bochum in Germany and Moorhead State University on the east coast of the US. They have had the ability to track the probe for quite some time, as they have larger dishes. And obviously, as the probe comes closer, small dishes will be able to pick it up and join in. But they have software-defined radios set up that's essentially hooked into the antenna that's the dish, and they then demodulate that with some really neat software that Phil Kahn wrote, which is kind of a world record for this kind of decoding in a way. And then that's piped through this aggregation system. I've got that running on my server, and then it basically feeds the telemetry out into the world. The software that parses it and makes sense of it, I've open source and put on my GitHub, so people have been downloading that and watching it as the days go by, as the dishes track the probe when it's visible in the sky. Wei Tong on Twitter wants to know what the maximum distance is that you think you'll be able to keep in touch with the satellite. Should we expect to be able to follow it for the next 16 years, or assuming that the probe keeps going, or will we lose touch with it at some point? Sure. I think 16 years may be a bit of a stretch. Certainly, as it flies back out, distances will increase. I think Bochum was able to decode telemetry off the top of my head, maybe a month ago. So it'll be a considerable distance. So at least maybe another month or two. Maybe if we get some Arecibo time, it'll be even more as the dish is bigger. But certainly we'll be able to get some good data for a good portion of time to come.
Chris, so let's say if we're following the spacecraft for the next couple of months, how should we expect what it's recording about the solar wind, the influence of the sun, to change over that time? It's presumably moving out of the Earth's sphere of influence.
Yeah, so it'll be in the solar wind, this constant stream of particles coming out from the sun. And the exciting thing, I think, for space scientists who are studying space weather is to be able to compare the measurements of ISEE-3 with those that are around Earth. So we have those measurements within the magnetosphere, spacecraft like Cluster, and also spacecraft that are at the first Lagrange point, this point between the Earth and the Sun where a spacecraft can orbit. And ISEE-3 was the first spacecraft ever to do that. It's kind of like bread and butter to space scientists now, but that was the first spacecraft to do that. So again, the pedigree is there. But by comparing the measurements between these two spacecraft, we can get some idea of the scale sizes of the turbulence in the solar wind and the structures within the solar wind. And that's really important information if we're going to have any ability to start forecasting solar wind interactions with any accuracy. Space weather is the tracking of these storms through space, and it's generally accepted that we're kind of about where weather forecasting was in the 1950s. So any extra weather buoy out in the ocean making measurements is really, really useful.
And Lucian, we should remind people what the solar wind is. After all, that's the scientific excitement of this mission.
Sure. I mean, the temptation, right, is to think of our sun as a sort of light bulb that just shines down this bright light on us and warms our planet. But really, the outer atmosphere of the sun is this very dynamic place. So a lot of the things that we observe from the solar wind and also other space weather effects have to do with the sun's magnetic field, which create basically streaming of charged particles out into space, sometimes energetic events like solar flares, which shower our planet and the rest of our solar system with both high energy radiation in the ultraviolet and X-ray, and also energetic particles and actual plasma in the form of coronal mass ejections, these big blobs that are essentially ejected off of the sun. And understanding this is really important, not just for our own existence here on Earth and our ability to forecast, but it's really important for our ability to understand the conditions on extrasolar planets as well. Our sun is one of the only stars that we can really study in detail, and we get so much more detail about the sun than we do about any other star, that it really is our Rosetta Stone for understanding these exoplanet systems that we're finding. And so it's not just studying our home, it's studying all of the potential real estate out there in the universe. And that's really what this will help us do.
And of course, that was the original mission for ISEE-3 as well. That's why it went to L1 in the first place. And we've got a video now that introduces the original mission. That was like a video CV, wasn't it? But we're delighted to say we're joined now, I think, from McMoon's by Bob Farquhar, who's the original flight director for ISEE-3, and by David Dunham, who did the trajectory design and has been involved in the project from the beginning. Bob and David, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you.
Delighted to talk to you both. How exciting, that's a stupid question, but you must be very excited to be back in touch with your spacecraft after all of this time.
Well, I don't know about being in touch, but I'm going to wave at it as it goes by. Say hello and goodbye. I can't wait to do that.
Was there any thought? I mean, David, you were responsible for the trajectory design, and you were responsible for for sending the probe towards a comet in the first place, and then into this orbit that's brought it back round to us today. Was there any thought that you'd be sitting here in 2014 and be able to get useful data from it?
Well, I thought I'd be sitting at Goddard or someplace, but I'm great, glad to be here and really thankful for all the great work that has been done here at McMoon's to actually get this bird going again when other people gave up on it. So it's just too bad the pressurant didn't work out, and we aren't flying by the moon on the right side. We hope to be on the left side of the moon, but instead we're flying on the right side and getting a kick in the pants, sending it farther away from the Earth rather than getting captured into Earth orbit. But we've had fun. We had a lot of fun figuring out what we could have done if things would have worked. So we had some neat plans, and so we're excited. We'll see what happens also in 15 years when it comes back again.
Well, I'm worried what the scientists are going to say to me. They're going to say, yes, they're going to say, yes, we told you so. You really did steal this spacecraft. Because I told them, no, we just borrowed it. I was going to put it back into halo orbit. And now I can't do it now, see? So this is bad. And so now, yeah, now they have a point to say I've stolen it. But if we would have brought it back in the halo orbit, I was going to steal it again to go out to Comet Wirtanen.
Oh, okay. So that when you talk about stealing the spacecraft, that was when the craft was diverted from its solar mission to go and visit a comet. I've read that you didn't ask for permission before you did that. Is that true?
Well, this time, no. I set up a meeting with the scientists, and we had a great meeting with the science team, and they took a vote, and the vote was not to go to the comet. But then I had people helping me at NASA headquarters. One guy in particular, Charlie Pellerin, was down there. And he organized a special committee of the National Academy of Sciences that said, yes, we should go to the comet. And the NASA headquarters management overruled the ISEE-3 science team, which almost never happens. But they overruled them because of the endorsement from the National Academy of Sciences, and that took it out to the comet then.
What did we find out from that trip to a comet?
Well, we found out about the interaction of the comet's tail with the solar wind, and a lot of things about space physics, things I know nothing about, but other people do. You need to talk to Ed Smith out of JPL. He's the magnetometer guy.
Okay, and I know the magnetometer's up and running once again. Chris, you've been looking at some of the original ISE papers. I know. What stands out about the mission now?
Well, its ambition, I think. It's the first mission to go to this L1 halo orbit, and that's now, it's like a car park for spacecraft now, the Roger point. But so this is the first spacecraft that went there. But also, I mean, all throughout my career, and I have to say I was 11 years old when ISEE-3 was launched. I was going to try and dig out a picture of me in shorts to prove it, but so all throughout my science career, we've been looking forward to a mission known as Cluster, which is a 4-spacecraft mission which was going to help us understand the difference between something changing with time and something changing over a large space. And ISEE-3 had 2 sister spacecraft, and it was originally proposed to do this, to answer this question. And it's really important when you've got such a big volume of space to have spot measurements in different places, so you can tell if something's changing throughout the entire environment or whether it's just changing near your spacecraft and moving across your environment. So yes, the ambition of this mission was quite astonishing, and it brought a wry smile to my face, because all of the statements in the mission papers are the ones that I heard throughout my career of how the next missions were going to be. So I think it blazed a trail that everyone has subsequently been trying to keep up with.
Bob and David, did it feel like an ambitious mission at the time? Was it that you were trying to do something difficult, or was this something that had been planned for and that you were pretty sure would work?
I didn't quite hear all that. Could you repeat that, please?
Chris was talking about the ambition of the original mission, how exciting it was to be going to L1 and how important that was. And I was asking whether it felt like an ambitious mission at the time, or whether this was something that you knew would come off.
Oh yeah, I knew this. I mean, this was part of my doctoral thesis at Stanford University. So, we'd worked out most of the details. So I wasn't
and
too
it had
concerned.
to work if it was your thesis, then.
Well, it had to work because they invited my thesis advisor, John Breakwell, to the launch. But they told him to bring a copy of my thesis with him to the launch, and if it didn't work, that he should revoke my doctoral degree.
Wow. No pressure.
When I went out to the stereo launch, there's nothing quite like seeing your career strapped to the top of a firework. I didn't have that added pressure of someone standing next to me with my thesis.
Bob and David, so we talked a bit about where this project started with the original mission. I have to ask, I guess, whether you're disappointed that we're not sitting in a control room in Goddard. Are you disappointed that it's not NASA that's in touch with the spacecraft?
We don't care about NASA. As long as somebody's in touch with it, that's all that counts, and the scientists are getting their data.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, it's tempting, isn't it? I think certainly at the top, when we were talking to Keith and Dennis, there's a temptation to set this up as NASA versus the rest. But it sounds like you two don't feel like that. The important thing is the work's being done.
Right. NASA gave up on it, so I'm great. We wouldn't be here at all if it weren't for you guys. So.
Well, not all the people at NASA gave up on it.
Right.
But I don't want to say who they are who didn't give up. There's some managers at NASA headquarters that were backing us up, but I better be quiet about who did what.
Lucian, I guess. We have to see this discussion about NASA in context of government funding and a tough time for lots of spacecraft.
Yeah, that's really true. It's an unfortunate thing that it takes so much effort, literally decades of people's careers, many millions of dollars to launch spacecraft into space, and it's an unfortunate thing that the funding environment is such that one is put in a position of turning off a telescope or, no longer using something that is actually still usable, can still do that work. It's infinitely cheaper to use something that's already in space. You could still get good work out of it, but, things are very, very constrained. And that means that, NASA is constantly put in the position of having to reprioritize what they spend the funds they do have on. And that unfortunately means that not everybody gets to continue. And it's really sad because those missions, those instruments, whatever they happen to be, they continue to do good work and they continue to explore the universe. And it's a shame to have something like the funding environment stand in the way of that.
So with that in mind, another question from social media, and remember you can ask us questions on Twitter or on Google+, particularly questions for Bob and Keith for Bob and David if you have them at the moment. Another question online is, well, okay, so what's next? Which other satellites should we be aiming for? I guess, David, Bob, do you know of anything else we should be rescuing?
Yes. I just had an idea a few days ago that there's another old spacecraft that's orbiting the L1 libration point, and they're just sitting it there spinning around and around that libration point, and it's done its job. It's the Wind spacecraft, which was launched in 1995, and it did lots of neat things, but they sort of parked it there. And so I said, well, one of the things we wanted to do with ISEE-3, if everything had worked, is we would have put it back in the halo orbit for a while or whatever. But we had an ambition because there's going to be a highly active comet that's going to pass unusually close to the Earth in December of 2018. And so we hope to use a lunar swingby to send ISEE-3 out to that comet. Well, we can't do that now but it occurred to me we could do it with wind. So if we could work a mission with wind, just like we did with ISEE-3 back in 1982, wind could become the second spacecraft ever to fly through the tail of a comet. It's also a particles and fields experiment, a suite of instruments with no camera, rather similar to the ISEE-3 spacecraft, but of course a little more modern since it was launched in 1995.
Yeah, this time I have to give Dave all the credit. This time he thought of the idea. He usually gives me credit for thinking of, well, I take all the credit. He does all the work, I take all the credit. But this time he thought of the idea, so I can't take the credit for this one. But I did think of how to get out to where 10 in the first time, so then we'd use that again. So I'll take credit for that one.
Yes. Teamwork is key in all these things, especially on deciding who should take the credit. But actually, we talked a lot about L1, and David, you're a trajectories expert. Could you say something about what L1 is and why it's special, and then perhaps about how one would go about leaving it if we were to go on to the Wind spacecraft?
Well, there's a lot of L1s. There's one for every two-body system in the solar system. So there's an L1 for the moon, and there's an L1 for the Sun-Mercury system, L1 for Sun-Mars, so but you're talking about the Sun-Earth L1 point.
It's where ISEE-3 was,
So that's the one you're talking
and so
about.
it's a stable point, right? That's the point, that we can orbit L1.
It's an unstable point. It's an unstable point, but we can. We don't really orbit it. It looks like we're orbiting it in this relative frame that we're showing all the time, and that makes the halo orbit around the Earth.
Excellent.
It's the balancing point between the gravity of the Sun and the Earth, plus the rotation of the coordinate system you're working in, and it all goes to zero at this point, which is about 4 times the distance to the Moon. It's 1 million kilometers. Or a million miles, towards the Sun from the Earth.
So but it's an equilibrium point.
Right, it's an equilibrium point. So something that you put it there, it will stay there. But the problem is one of the directions is unstable. So you do have to keep doing small maneuvers to keep on track, to keep it there. But you don't have to do those maneuvers very often. So that's why it's practical. Some of the people, when they were first proposing this, they said, "Oh, but it's an unstable orbit. You can't put a spacecraft there." But yeah, we proved that you can. And of course, now there are more than about 24 spacecraft that have flown similar orbits. Both.
But what'll really happen in the future is people are worried about global warming and stuff, and the sun is going to get a lot harder in the next 200 years. So we're thinking of a big sun shield that we could put up there, and you can. It's like a big solar sail, and stabilize that there, and that would block out part of the sun.
Excellent. Well, Bob and David, thank you for talking to us. So we'll catch up with you in a bit. We are now just a few minutes from Lunar Flyby, and I think we have and what I'm told is an excellent intro sequence to get us to the point where we fly above the surface of the Moon. So if we can cue that now.
Let's go.
I told you that was going to be an excellent intro sequence. Coming up, so what's happening for those just joining us is that the rebooted spacecraft ISEE-3 is about to fly about 16 kilometers above the surface of the Moon. I hope that's right. 16. Does that sound right? People in mission control? That doesn't. Anyway, we're about to reach our closest point above the surface of the Moon. Chris, while we wait for that for confirmation that that's happening, does the Moon have any influence on the solar wind? We've talked about the influence of the Sun on the spacecraft and on Earth's magnetosphere, but what should we expect while we're near the Moon?
Well, I guess it all depends whereabouts the Moon is. I didn't go and look to see, but if it's, the Earth's magnetic field is pretty extensive, and the Moon doesn't have a magnetic field to speak of. It doesn't have an atmosphere, and so unlike the Earth, it doesn't have this protective magnetic bubble which can deflect the solar wind. So the solar wind actually plows into the surface of the Moon. It can electrify dust, and that dust can then levitate above the surface. So I think the spacecraft itself will be mainly experiencing the magnetic environment of the Earth, but of course that will be being perturbed by the presence of the Moon, simply because it will be affecting the flow of the solar wind.
Excellent. Now, I think we could go back to mission control. And I hope that standing by for us is Cameron Woodman, who's the current flight director. Cameron, are you there? Apparently, that's possibly a desk. Cameron, can you hear us? We're not quite there yet by the sound of things. But Chris, the solar wind does have an effect on the Moon itself. The surface of the Moon is processed by the solar wind. Yes,
and I will hold up my hand here and say this is not my field, but yeah, the particles in the solar wind actually are. The Earth is protected from the solar wind by a magnetic field which can deflect these particles. The lower energy ones are deflected to the north and south poles, where they enter our atmosphere and they heat the gases there and cause it to glow to form the aurora. So that's the indication that the solar wind's interacting with the Earth. But on the Moon, they will be constantly hitting the surface, and that sort of atomic scale interaction between these energetic particles in the solar wind and the lunar surface actually does cause a chemical change within those rocks. I believe it's colloquially called lunar gardening.
Yeah, possibly the world's most confusing term. I think we are now ready in mission control. So Cameron, are you there? All right, apparently an earpiece is being fixed, so we can get a satellite to fly past the Moon, but talking to people in California is rather tricky. Lucienne, this is exciting, isn't it?
It really is. I think it's exciting to have everybody on board and in this mission where it really is people directly controlling the spacecraft to fly by our nearest neighbor and to learn something new that we've never known before about this really dynamic, complicated and metaspheric structure around the Earth and our interaction with the solar wind.
I think it's exciting as well. I mean, the team are calling the extended mission a citizen science mission, and you and I have talked about citizen science many times. It does go to show what you could do with the resources on the internet and with the kind of expertise that can be summoned at relatively short notice.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the ability to really harness the wisdom of the crowd and people's willingness to be involved through really easily accessible tools and through the web has, I really think, transformed the sense of involvement that people have over discovery. No more is it about, waiting for some group of scientists that are sort of off in an ivory tower to come present the facts down like stone tablets off the mountain. Now kind of everybody can get their hands dirty and really be a part of that discovery process. And it's a really human thing, I think, to really want to know our universe. And so it's more exciting the more people get to do that.
It's great to follow along. Now, I think third time it occurred to me we were trying to talk to the flight director of the mission as he was flying a spacecraft past the Moon. But I think third time lucky, we now have at McMoon's Cameron Woodman. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me okay, Chris?
I can, yes. And next to you, I should introduce is Austin Epps, who's the lead engineer. So Austin, hopefully you can hear us too.
Yep.
Cameron, tell us, the first question is, how's it going? Where are we, and is the spacecraft okay?
It's going great, Chris. Thanks for asking. The spacecraft's doing great. It's flying by the Moon. I don't know what time it is right now, so I don't know how close it is to the Moon, but it's going to be...
Just gone past.
It's just gone past, so it's just slightly past 13,000 kilometers from the Moon right now. And everything seems to be going fine.
Thank you for correcting me. 13,000 kilometers. I thought 13 kilometers didn't sound right. Cameron,
a little scary.
Yeah, it would have been fascinating.
Yeah.
So what determines that distance? I mean, it sounds churlish, but why aren't you going closer?
Well, we tried going closer. I think Marco talked a little bit about that in his propulsion system. Like the initial trajectory that we wanted to do was going to bring the spacecraft 50 kilometers from the Earth's surface, or from the Moon's surface, and that would have adjusted the orbit enough to allow it to be basically captured back into the Earth-Moon system, taken back to the Lagrange point to continue its original mission.
So with that done, what does a flight director do? I mean, what's your role in the mission?
Well, my role as a flight director is just to ensure that the flight is going off smoothly, but a large part of my job is kind of taken care of by having excellent people like Austin, Marco, and Ballant helping out. As a flight director, I don't really have to do much during the mission because it's all run by the experts. So Ballant and Austin setting up the link, Austin taking care of the spacecraft, and Marco taking care of the propulsion system and power makes things pretty easy for me.
What's been the scariest moment of the mission so far? What were the points where you thought this was right up against the edge?
Well, for me, two moments stand out. The first is in Arecibo, when we had the initial predicts of how much fuel we would need to change the course of the spacecraft, and it was quite insurmountable at that time. We later found out that the spacecraft is in a better trajectory than we initially thought, so that kind of went away. But as far as the actual mission, I would say that our trajectory course maneuver when we saw the thing sputter out was probably that moment for me.
Yeah, it's a nasty moment. What about you as an engineer watching that, Austin? I mean, in Star Trek, this would be your fault. And you'd be getting a call from the bridge to ask why there's no power to the engines. So how was that experience?
Well, anytime we were touching the propulsion system, it was pretty nerve-wracking because that's how you can lose a spacecraft. You do something wrong when you're handling the propulsion system. It's happened before. There was a lunar mission in the 90s called Clementine. A software glitch caused it to spin up and out of control, and they lost contact, lost the bird. So that's very nerve-wracking whenever you're handling propulsion system commanding. You got to double and triple check everything. You got to make sure that you have a good handle on the physics of the situation and also the health of the spacecraft, that you're not overlooking anything.
What about the power? We had a question from Ross123540, which I'm guessing is a Twitter name, James Ross Harrison, in fact, about the power requirements for the spacecraft. This is always a big deal on any mission, but how much? I presume it's solar powered. How much are you playing with?
Yeah, it is solar powered. One of the interesting things from this mission is that it's one of the oldest solar powered spacecraft that anyone has recontacted. So we get a much longer baseline for the data of the degradation of the solar panels. When you launch a solar-powered spacecraft, typically you have a beginning of life power requirement and an end of life power requirement because you need to account for the degradation of the solar panels over a long period of time. And one of the things that we found from the spacecraft was that the degradation models were very, very conservative. We actually had a lot more power than one would anticipate with a spacecraft this old. So I think where we're at right now is about 146 watts of power, which really, when you think about it, is not very much. A 100-watt light bulb, you can power 1.5 of those, and that's what's powering the entire spacecraft, 2 transmitters, 14 experiments, everything. So one of the challenges going forward is that, and Cameron will talk about the orbits a little bit later, but the orbit that we're heading to is further out from the sun, so we're going to have less power. We're going to need to take that into account as we set the spacecraft up for its interplanetary mission.
So let's talk. Well, let's talk about that now, Cameron. So what orbit are we on? And I'm still struggling slightly to get my head around exactly where the spacecraft's heading.
Okay, so to tell you about where it's heading, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where it's been in the last 30 years. And to use an analogy, the spacecraft and the Earth have been orbiting the Sun. The ISEE-3 spacecraft has been on a smaller orbit. So essentially, I use an analogy of a track and field track, ISEE-3 spacecraft was on an interior lane. The Earth would be on one of the middle lanes. And as both of them go around the Sun, the spacecraft, because it's traveling a little bit faster and has less distance to travel, will end up outpacing the Earth. And so what we see now is 30 years later is the spacecraft coming back and lapping the Earth. And it's doing so in such a way where it's going to have a close flyby of the moon. It's going to steal a little bit of the moon's energy, and that will slingshot or catapult the spacecraft essentially to one of the outer lanes of the track. And so now the spacecraft's going to be slowing down with respect to the Earth. And because it has further to travel on the outer lanes, and because it's traveling slower, the Earth is going to start pulling away from it, and the spacecraft's going to start lagging behind. And then in about 15 years, we should see another close approach to the Earth-Moon system. And where that will be determined based on our ranging data we'll get after this lunar flyby.
Okay, so an exact date to be determined. We had a couple of people on social media wanting to let us know, wanting to let their kids know when they should look out for this spacecraft. So watch this this space. So that's where we're going. And I asked this question earlier of Balint, who I think is still with us, the software engineer for the radio. How long do we expect to be in touch with the spacecraft?
It looks like from current estimates, based on what we've seen as it was approaching us, it'll be a couple of months, a few months. If we can get bigger dishes online and listening there, obviously we can extend that. The bigger the dish, the longer the tracking.
Cameron and Austin, this has obviously been a unique experience. How's it compared with what you do in your normal lives? Is controlling a spacecraft like running any system, or are there unique challenges?
Go first? Yeah, you can.
So I have some background in spacecraft operations, working for companies like Boeing and General Dynamics. This is completely different. It's been an amazing experience. It's really difficult to describe how special this has been, from the team that Dennis was able to put together to Keith's job, help in fundraising, and all the support that we're getting from the public is just been quite special. I can't really describe it. I want to thank everyone that's helped out, that's contributed, that's talked about this mission. It's just been great, and to work with these guys like Austin and Balint, Marco, Casey, Jacob, it's just been a dream job.
I'm mostly impressed you all still like each other. What about you? What about you, Austin?
This is a very interesting project. I was involved with the Lunar Orbiter Image Recovery Project with Keith and Dennis prior to this, so I already had a little bit of experience with very small team space adventures. But there's this very much a small team dynamic here. Everyone has to wear a lot of hats, and it makes the job very, very interesting.
One thing we haven't talked about, we keep talking about the spacecraft, and we talked about its thrusters and its radio and its software, but to scientists like Chris in particular, what they care about, the instruments. After all, the spacecraft is just a means of getting the instruments to an interesting place. So you've also had to try and get the instruments online. Could you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, that's an ongoing process right now. I guess I'm not sure. I was in mission control, so I'm not sure what's already been touched on, but I can give a very brief description.
We haven't talked about the instruments at all, so...
Okay, great. So this spacecraft was intended to measure the solar wind. And what the solar wind is, people say that term, and it's rarely really explained. So very simply, what the solar wind is charged particles coming off the sun. And when I say charged particles, I mean pieces of atoms. So there's electrons and protons. There's also bigger chunks of atoms. So say you take an oxygen atom, you strip off several electrons, you fire that out of the sun at very high speed. This stuff is coming out of the sun all the time, and so you can measure that either directly, and this spacecraft has a number of instruments that measure those particles very directly. You can also take measurements of the solar wind more indirectly by measuring things like radio waves, gamma rays, X-rays. This spacecraft has instruments for all of that. And also the magnetic field. It has a set of magnetometers. So there's apparently a very well-known relationship between the orientation of the magnetic field and when solar storms come. And solar storms, I don't know who here is familiar with the event that happened in 2012, but there was a solar storm that missed the Earth, but had it hit the Earth, you would have seen a lot of damage to communication satellites, possibly to terrestrial communication and power grids. So it's very important to understand the solar wind. You know, it's important for any technological civilization that uses things like communication satellites and power grids.
Yeah, but excellent. Well, we'll let you get back to work. Thanks for joining us. And Lucian, it occurs to me you, of course, work on other stars other than the Sun, which have space weather as well. What do we know about how the Sun's space weather compares to other systems and other worlds that might be out there?
Well, you know, our Sun is a relatively well-behaved star. It's sort of out of its tempestuous adolescence and into a much milder form of existence. We rotate on our axis about every 30 days or so, just roughly. And the Sun has relatively mild space weather. Now, having said that, as was just mentioned, that space weather can really influence us here on Earth. One of the best known for people that study the Sun and other stars, best known events is something called the Carrington event that happened in the mid-1800s, a very, very large flare that was observed and really influenced our planet in the sense that it induced current in telegraph wires. It set fire to the telegraph papers and the machines. And that was before we really had a technological age. It's long before we had things like space satellites or very interconnected power grids. Now, one of the questions for us is, how common is something like the Carrington event? Well, one would hope that if you wanted to study that, you wouldn't just wait for it to happen again here on Earth. What you would do is go out and study large numbers of other stars and to try and place our Sun in context. Because the Sun is the one that we know the most about, but we don't have any basis for comparison if we don't study other stars. So we know that there are stars that are relatively quiet compared to the Sun, and by quiet I mean they don't have a whole lot of these big flares, they don't have big spots. But we also see very, very extreme examples of stars that have huge spots and gigantic flares. And we try to understand those so that we can both place our Sun in context and understand some of the planetary systems that we're finding.
And Chris, so we get this ability to compare, but we can also look at the Sun over time. Chris, you mentioned earlier that the Sun's in a particularly odd mood right now. It's in a very quiet phase. What exactly is going on, and do we know why that's happening?
Yeah, it's definitely adolescent. I would agree with that. So the 2012 event that was alluded to earlier was actually this actually went over one of the stereo spacecraft, and we were able to measure the speed. It was traveling, it got there in something like 19 hours, which means it was traveling at something like 2,500 kilometers a second, so immensely fast bubble of magnetic material flying out from the Sun. And that's about as fast as the Carrington event. That hit Earth in around 17 hours from the observations of the flare that Lucian was talking about. So even though it's now in a good old teenage sulk, it's not really doing very much. The number of spots on the surface, which is an indication of the complexity of the Sun's magnetic field, the number of spots has been a lot lower. The Sun has this 11-year activity cycle, and so every 11 years you expect it to peak and for it to get more mass ejections and for there to be more space weather events on Earth, more aurora, more power grid interference, that kind of thing. But this particular solar cycle, which peaked last year, has been much smaller than we'd expect. And so some people are suggesting, looking at the geological record of these cosmic rays, the energetic particles that are coming through space, those are modulated on this 11-year cycle. And looking back through geological records, you can see that the Sun has activity cycles that are of the order of a few hundred years. And it looks like we might be coming out of one of the grand solar maxima and heading towards a period of much quieter solar activity. You can still have these enormous mass ejections during these times. In fact, they can be even faster because the solar wind's much weaker, and so there's nothing in front of it to slow it down. And so as they come barreling out from the Sun, they arrive at Earth at great speed.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Some of the scientific background for this mission. We can go back to Mission Control now. We're rejoined by Keith Carring, the project director for the ISEE-3 Reboot project. And with him, I hope, is Greg Smith, who is the deputy director of NASA's Solar System Exploration Research Virtual Institute, which is a mouthful. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here.
You're sort of embodying the relationship between NASA and the ISSE project. And I'd like to kick off with a question we had in, which is about the relationship between the two organizations.
Yeah.
And it was Kelly Garadi who said, how supportive has NASA been, Keith? And Greg, for you, we'd like to know what the most difficult part of the partnership was.
Well, this wouldn't have been possible without our crazy idea, but also NASA's support. I mean, they sort of said they weren't going to do anything with the spacecraft, but we really did need their assistance. And to their credit, they stepped up to it. And it's just been a marvelous relationship where we've been able to blend the best of outside NASA and inside NASA. And thanks a lot to Greg and his staff for doing that.
Absolutely, yeah. It's really been a pleasure doing this. It's fun doing something really new like this. I have to say, I had to go all the way back to 1958 with the Space Act, because Congress, in their wisdom back then, realized that NASA was going to do cool new stuff, even back then, and they would need new ways of interacting with people, and they formed what we call Space Act agreements, and that's what we have with the ISEE-3 reboot team. I'm the NASA lead for this, and it's just been a real pleasure helping these guys out, making sure that they have comm with our friends at Goddard, and just basically clearing all the boulders in the path of this effort. So it's been really cool.
Do you think this is the kind of thing that will happen more often?
Hope so.
Yeah. I would certainly like to see this be a Pathfinder.
Well, people are excited. We've got a couple of... I'm just going to bounce around a bit and go through some questions, all asked with the hashtag ISEE-3, of course, so you can still get your questions in. One from Zvedidichko, I guess, wants to know how the obtained data will be distributed and how quickly people will get it. And Steve Sheridan, Keith, also wants to know about the plans for presenting data. So people are still following on with the mission.
Well, the interesting thing is where the working that we've done with Google has been great, because we've got this wonderful website up now, which is taking the data as we get it, and it'll get even better as we get more of the instruments online and running. Our hope, and we use the phrase citizen science, which you and I have chatted about on Twitter, is normally a space mission will take this data and it'll go somewhere, and eventually it comes out later as results. Well, we wanted to just put this data out there online, even in the most raw format, so that people can do whatever they do with it. We don't even know what they're going to do, and that's kind of the interesting part about it. And we feel, at least I feel, that you really shouldn't have to take an entrance exam to participate in a space mission. And why not? I mean, at the end of the day, why not put it out there? Nobody's going to get hurt.
So if we're doing our sales pitch, what instruments can we get access to? What data do we get?
Well, we're sort of working backwards from the magnetometer was on, and we're getting data back from that. And some of the plasma experiments, now we're getting information back. And as has been mentioned before, we're already looking at data that's coming back on several of the instruments, and it's matching up with other spacecraft are telling us has been happening on the sun. So this thing's cooking. I mean, it's sending back real data. The issue is trying to parse the data into a format that we now use in the 21st century. Some of it's a bit of an antiquated way of looking at it. But we're going to put as raw as we can out there on the internet so that people can, redo the whole interpretive thing themselves. That's part of the learning process. Normally you get it out there and it's already been, regurgitated and gone over by others. Why shouldn't everybody else have the fun?
Right. One other thing to add to this is that NASA, really since the 1970s, has become very serious about archiving its data. We have the National Space Science Data Center. We have the Planetary Data System, where these various data products go, and a predecessor project that these folks did that I suspect you've talked about already, the Lunar Orbiter Image Reconstruction Project. All of the data from that is going into the Planetary Data System, so that scientists now, 10 years from now or 3 generations from now, they're all going to have that available. Just as a little comment, one of the principal investigators from our institute, he told me that he had been looking for some of that data for 30 years. And boy, if that doesn't give you goosebumps that we're able to give that kind of stuff back to current scientists, I don't know what would.
So we talked about the longevity of the data. We're getting a couple of questions about the technology. So Justin G417 wants to know what the biggest obstacle when dealing with the old technology on board was. And I saw a question as well from John T. Willis, who wants to know whether the satellite runs on vacuum tubes or whether, it's 1978.
Well,
so did we have transistors?
Okay, it's disco era. Okay, so if you think, now actually the spacecraft, the battery died 20 years ago. It doesn't really have a computer. And when the instruments are on, they're on. They just send the data back. It doesn't really have the ability to remember anything. You can't say, do this tomorrow. You have to say, do this now. That said, a magnetometer is a magnetometer. I mean, it's sending the data back. It's sending it back in a standard format. It's a little antiquated. And we had to do some, again, dumpster diving for science here to find the old manuals to figure out how to tell software to pretend it's the old software. But once you do that, it's just an API. And it's just sending the stuff live to the website now. So that the hackers and the radio guys and all that, they've done the hard work. Now we're just pumping it out on the internet. We hope to pump more and more and more.
Yeah. And as far as tubes go, I'm not aware of any that are on it. I mean, I guess I'm a product of the disco era myself, and I can remember holding transistor radios to my ear to listen to them. So transistors, that was invented in the 50s actually, and
good. All right.
and so by that time it was pretty well a mature technology as far as it's gone.
Well, good to have that answer. I wonder if John T. Willis is the world's last vacuum tube salesman. Chris, during that answer, I could see you nodding away. Will you be going into the office and getting hold of the ISEE-3 data?
I'm certainly going to go and have a look. I'm really fascinated by this, and I agree. There's no such thing as bad data, I don't think. I mean, well, obviously you can have a bad instrument, but if that instrument's producing data, and stereo has been a revelation to me in that respect. So it was set up with these wide field cameras to look at the solar wind, but actually we're seeing the stars in the background, we're seeing dust around the solar wind, we're seeing dust particles hit the spacecraft, and one man's data is another man's noise. So to have a whole other instrument, I don't care how old it is, it's still information, and information is fantastically important.
And Greg, that speaks to the point you were making about having systems to access all of this data as well. So not trying to predict who to distribute the data to, but to have central places where people can come to get whatever we do know about the solar system.
That's absolutely critical to have that, and to have it. There you go. To have it in the rawest form possible, because we don't know what kind of analyses are going to be interesting. I mean, I mentioned this scientist in our institute, Mihai Harani. He's at University of Colorado, and the work that he's doing with us is studying dust, not just on the moon, but on near-Earth asteroids and on the moons of Mars. And so there were actually a couple of dust instruments that were part of the Apollo lunar surface experiment package, and most of the data was thought lost, and we're kind of recovering some of that. And so with that, that's just barely starting to shed a few new insights, and who knows the kind of questions that might be asked by scientists in the year 2100.
Yeah, this is, for example, what I'm holding up. This is one of the Lunar Orbiter. This is Lunar Orbiter 5, a data tape. It weighs about 10 pounds. It has 2 images on it. And this is the other project. It's at moonviews.com. And it's sort of the predecessor for ISEE-3. And it was where we had to get old hardware that had been made 50 years ago. It was broken. The people had retired or died. And people said you couldn't do it. It would cost too much. It's against the laws of physics. And we said, sure, why not? And then when ISEE-3 came up, we said, well, it's the same thing. What's so hard about that? But again, this is real data, and the images that we've been able to pull back are in a very similar way what we're hoping to do with ISEE-3, except ISEE-3 is sending back data now, in real time, 21st century data.
No, it's great stuff, and certainly everyone I speak to is excited by this project. I see from the social media questions that we have some ambitious viewers. I think Linda Laban, who we've already had a question from, wants to know about the future of this sort of citizen science or crowdfunding for space exploration. And I saw somebody else asking, Michael Hopper wants to know whether it would be plausible to launch a crowd-funded civilian-controlled spacecraft.
Yeah.
So Keith's grin says it all, really.
Yeah, sure. That's on the list of things we would like to try and do. And we're not alone. And of course, what we're hoping here is that this crazy idea that we had will inspire others to try and do the same thing. And the more that people say, hey, this is actually possible, whether it's getting old stuff to work again or just to launch new stuff, and to go to the out to the public and say you're $5 or $10 if you get enough people can actually make a difference. Because the amount of money we raised, $160,000, that enabled us to do the travel and build the hardware. But coincidentally, that's enough to build and launch a CubeSat. And $160,000 is pretty much anything that any community anywhere could raise if they went around selling candy bars. So we're hoping that we've dropped the bar, the threshold low enough that people could say, hey, we could do that too. Maybe not just for space. Maybe it's another project that doesn't have anything to do with space at all.
Yeah, one of the things for your viewers, the CubeSat is a standard that was developed by Stanford professor Bob Twiggs, where you have a cube that's about this size, about 10 centimeters on a side, and your first thought using your your glasses, your rose-colored glasses from the 1970s or so, would be, what the heck could you do with something that maybe you could just fit 3 vacuum tubes in or something like that? But it turns out that the thing is, nowadays you can fit some pretty serious scientific instruments into a package that size, with the launch costs being what they are, the launch cost for something this size is going to be much, much smaller than for a significantly larger satellite. And so, like Keith says, just to underscore that, what this has done is this has made space available and accessible to colleges, even to high schools, to states. One of the things that we helped start here at NASA Ames is a state-based space program that is going really well out of the state of Kentucky, run by a new corporation, Kentucky Space. So there's just a whole lot of really cool things going on when you give this into the hands of the people, and we can now do that.
And actually, we found out one of the dishes that actually has been listening to our spacecraft and talking to Morehead State University in Kentucky. We learned of them because of this CubeSat program and the Kentucky Space Program, so it's very synergistic. And the trick is, again, when you lower the level of what it costs to participate in the technology and so forth, you go from, it's like a pyramid, you go from only a few to suddenly there's this vast number of people that can say, hey, I can do this too. And what happens when you sort of enable not only hundreds, but now thousands and millions of people? Hopefully it gets busy.
Greg, is there any sense that NASA gets distracted by these efforts? After all, you can make the argument that NASA is using an archaic form of crowdfunding that works very well. It's, of course, taxpayer support. Those funds are allocated based on mainly, at least partly on scientific grounds. There's a sense of priorities that distinguish between the Galaxy mission I would like, the Star Spot Hunter that Lucy Ann's dreaming of, and Chris's Solar Wind. Is there any sense that this is a distraction and that you can get pulled by groups that do have the money to invest in this stuff?
I don't think so. No, I don't think it's a distraction at all, at least from my own perspective. And the reason for that is as we're looking at doing different kinds of things. ISEE-3 is something that NASA had decided that it was not going to do for funding reasons, and thank goodness a private concern led by Keith and Dennis Wingo was able to step in and do that. Our objective, as set by the administration, is big projects. Projects that really are difficult would be very difficult to do by other kinds of means. And I don't see this changing anytime soon. And gosh, if we can have smaller projects such as this, that can be taken over by small groups, or even initiated, like we were talking about earlier, starting small satellites of their own. I think that it would be not a distraction for NASA. It could really complement what NASA does.
Well, actually, it's interesting because the White House, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, has put a lot of things out and there's a lot of buzzwords: citizen science, DIY, the maker movement, open data. All of these things encourage. The president put this thing out saying, hey, go make a science project. And they've had these science fairs in the White House. this is, you know, very synergistic with that whole idea that, you know, the White House has been trying to get all the agencies to look at, where, you know, people say, hey, why not? Why don't we try this? And I think there's a synergy between the citizen science and the open sourcing community and the traditional ways of doing things, and I think they both can and will learn from each other.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just sorry, Greg. Thanks. Yeah. We're going to move on, but thank you for joining us and giving us the NASA view. It's been great to see you, Keith. I know you're hanging around for a second. In the meantime, Chris, I wanted to ask you. We've been talking about CubeSats. And also about citizen science, which needs authentic science to happen. Do you think that there is value for a solar physicist like yourself in having CubeSats with instruments in orbit around the Earth or in the near-Earth vicinity?
Well, definitely. I mean, one of the things that definitely springs to mind with any particle instrument is that the particle instruments we have in space at the moment only measure a certain part of the energy spectrum. And I did some research recently which showed that the solar wind could even influence things like lightning rates on the ground. And those are the thought to be caused by energetic particles that aren't quite as energetic as cosmic rays, which are accelerated on the shock fronts of supernova, but are more energetic than the average particles you see in the solar wind. But there's nothing up there to detect them. So a fleet of CubeSats with a very highly discriminating set of particle detectors on it would be a dream for me. I'd be able to do so much more science rather than just trying to infer things from the sort of experiments that we have now. But that's just a small example. Any small spacecraft, I mean, you think now the sort of technology on a mobile phone, and there are companies that are actually launching effectively a mobile phone into space because it has, if you think about it, it has the communications capabilities, it has cameras, it has small computers on board, and so there's an awful lot you can do with the sort of technology that we're becoming so familiar with now. And okay, so you might need to put a lot of extra effort in to make these things survive the radiation environment in space, but if you can make them small enough and cheap enough, well, hey, you just have more than one, and then if one gives out, you can launch another.
Barlin, it is remarkable how technologies change, and there has been this acceleration as we head towards the CubeSat era of communications technologies.
That's completely right, and that's what I love. I guess I can tell a little story. I'm actually in Vegas for DEF CON, which is one of the big security conferences. And
I'm glad you explained why you were in Vegas.
And I've been telling people about the project here, and it's been very well received, especially in the little software-defined radio community. But yeah, I had been chatting to Austin, and it turned out that we needed to reboot one of the science experiments on board the space probe, and so usually when we do that, I kind of log in and set up the link. At the time, I was actually attending one of the talks, and I connected to the Wi-Fi, and it's a hacker conference, and the guy next to me said, that's a really bad idea. So I disconnected and said, that's all right. I'll let you tether to my phone, because unfortunately my mobile reception was rather poor in there. So I tethered to his phone, remoted into the computer at Morehead State University, set up the radio link while simultaneously trying to pay attention to the talk, and then communicating with Austin, and then he would send the commands through, and it was pretty wild that I could be somewhere completely different, using a completely different kind of technology, radio technology in particular, a tiny little device that has incredibly, far advanced computing power and radio power, and then talk to this ancient satellite from which we can still get
an ancient satellite which doesn't even have a computer on board.
Precisely.
Yeah.
No, it's good. Lucia, what about, we're talking about CubeSats for solar physics, what about astronomical implications? Are there small missions that we could do? I mean, planet hunting has been tried with small satellites.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the primary ways that we find planets and that we study magnetic activity on other stars is through brightness variations. And one of the things that you can do with CubeSats, and that was actually done with sounding rockets for many years, just simple rockets that you send up at high altitude, measure the brightness of stars. You can do that with CubeSats and actually detect either the shadow of a planet passing in front of that star, blocking some of its light, what we call a planetary transit. And you can also measure the brightness of the star and how that changes with time, which tells us about features on the surface of the star, like star spots, magnetic features that are responsible for those stars' version of the solar wind or their stellar winds. So even though we can't have them sort of awash in that stream of energetic particles that we would want to be measuring for our sun, we can measure proxies for that, and that can help us relate what we know about those stars back to the sun. So CubeSats are useful both here and for studying our neighbors abroad, so to speak.
So plenty of exciting stuff ahead, but we could go back now, I think, for the final time to McMoon's, where I think we have Bob Farquhar, who we met earlier, the original flight director, and Keith Cowing and Dennis Wingo, who are the project directors for the Reboot project. Hello to you all again, gentlemen.
Greetings.
Hello. Hello there.
Hello, nice to talk to you all again. So, Bob, you're sitting on, you're sort of surrounded by these two who want control of your spacecraft.
Yeah, they're trying to steal it from me. I stole it from the other guys, and now they're trying to steal it back from me. You know, you got to watch out.
Well, what I was going to ask you before I realised that you were being held hostage was what advice you had for the project as it goes forward. You're a veteran of many of these missions. What do these guys need to know over the next few months as they try and stay in touch with the spacecraft?
They know a lot more than I do. How could I teach them anything? The spacecraft is it's flying by the Earth-Moon system, and they're going to get a lot of good science from this thing. A lot of good instruments are working, and so that's giving them some new data. So this is good. We did get more data back from the spacecraft. I would have liked to have recaptured it into Earth orbit again, so I could steal it again to go out to another comet, but I can't do that now. So I'll look for other ones to steal, though.
Yeah, I loved our discussion. Dennis and Keith, I don't know if you caught our discussion earlier, but Bob was saying there's another spacecraft. It's the Wind spacecraft, I think you said, which we can go after next. Is that a plausible project?
Yeah, I'll let Dennis talk to the technical aspect. There are a lot of satellites that, you know, are they abandoned or they're not being used? It's a sort of a gradation. But if you start offering this option of, well, what do you do when you're done with a prime mission? You know, we may see that the mission designers themselves may offer it up, or they may themselves find a lower cost way to keep doing it. So we'll have to wait and see. The sort of the secret's out, the cat's out of the bag. They know we're out here hunting for satellites, and we've got Bob on our team. So I don't know. They may be hugging their satellites, saying, "No, we're not done with it yet."
And Dennis, is any final thought? Excuse me, final thoughts from you? This does feel like an exciting era to be part of.
Well, it's great. For me, I used to work for an organization that does heliophysics, the Center for Space Plasma and Aeronomic Research. So to me, this is more fun than a barrel of monkeys, as we used to say when we were kids. And we're seeing the science data, and I'm just all kinds of excited. And as Keith says, and actually Dr. Grunsfeld from NASA, there are other spacecraft out there, and you know, you just never know what we may set our sights on next.
Well, I think that's a fabulous place to leave it from McMoon's. Dennis, Bob and Keith, thank you so much for joining us and letting our viewers share in what's been a very exciting venture. All that remains is for me to remind you all that you can go to spacecraftforall.com to explore a fabulous visualization of what's going on with the ISEE-3 spacecraft, and to thank our online guests, so Balint Sieber, Chris Scott, and Lucian Velkovich. Thank you so much for giving up some of your Sunday to join us. So from California, from Vegas, from New York, from Reading in the UK, and from here at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you all in about 16 years' time for the next flyby of ISEE-3. Thanks for joining us.
Take care.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.